I'll just start off. I just want to introduce a little update on the work I'm doing. It's more of a promo. We're hosting the first inaugural Indigenous Evaluation Summit in Canada. So that's actually going to be February 22nd and 23rd. And you can register for the summit at indigenouseval.org. That'll tell you what we're doing as a network as well. We are going to receive our first ever funding from the lead organization is Ontario Trillium Foundation. I don't know if you're aware of them, but another bunch of other funding partners came together, and under this envelope, OTF funds 50% of the startup cost. So the Indigenous Evaluation Network will be in business March 2024. So it's very exciting to have that off the ground in Canada. And just so you're aware, we do have a number of Americans, Australians, South African, and even South Korea. So we have a number of individuals also from Mexico who have signed up for the network. And people don't have to be Indigenous to sign up, because part of the work we want to do is support the education of non-Indigenous people as well. So that's a promo I thought I'd better just get out there, because we're in the final stretch of getting people registered for the summit. So I'm going to go into a presentation. I think we'll start there. When we think about wearing Indigenous evaluation lens, you can see these glasses here. We're thinking about reconciliation as well in terms of the process. Some of them call this a two-wide seeing. The CIHR, Canadian Institute for Health Research, they have an Indigenous Institute on Health Research. And on their website, they have a nice article on two-wide seeing and what that means. For this process, in terms of understanding how to bring Indigenous knowledge into evaluation, we can think of it wearing these types of glasses with both a square and a circle lens. I mean, sometimes we think of it, can we just simply turn the square into a circle? That's a question that remains to be answered. And there's a lot of different diversity across Indigenous communities. And I would say that there's not one recipe for any one community because of that diversification. So when we think about human behavior, I bring us to this question because when we are looking at logic models, there is definitely an inherent, maybe not recognized level of human behavior theory intermixed into the logic model statements that are put together. So when we think about human behavior, we can definitely understand that there's certain acts that we can all relate to across many different cultures. And I want to go into those 4 acts on the next slide. But before we go there, we'll just look at this A to Z diagram on the right. When we think of a typical logic model, we could pretty much summarize it into 3 parts: input, output, and then outcomes. So when we think of an Indigenous journey for evaluation, I was actually in the Yukon in Carcross-Taglish First Nation, where one of the staff had said that this is more of what she felt her journey, her program journey would be explained, better explained. And so one of the aspects, and I want to have time to get there today, but I'll just sort of give you an indication. So in the work that I've done, Brad was alluding to that, I've worked a lot with Indigenous Services Canada over the last 3 years. And they had provided funding. We're actually a partner with Indigenous Services Canada. They have a statement of that on their website as partnering with Johnston Research to do supporting Indigenous evaluation across Canada. And so one of the tools we developed was called Awakening the Journey Vision. And within that tool, we developed a 3-pillar process. So I had just explained the logic model could be put into 3 pillars: input, output, and outcomes. So the 3 pillars that you might see here, although it has A to Z, but to explain this journey here, may be better off understanding it through the 3 pillars of Awakening the Journey Vision model, which are spirit, relationship, and process. So Hopefully we will have more time to explain that, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of understanding of what would be a comparative to the logic model. And a lot of time has been put into that awakening the journey vision model. So thinking about the 4 acts I mentioned, we'll just put it into a table, Western and Indigenous. And this is not meant to say, oh, one's better than the other, or I'm not giving a bad grade to anybody. We're just more stating the reality that I believe I can see this reality. You may not agree with me, but when we think about achieving goals in a Western approach, we can often learn about those quite easily in a school and a workplace setting. And in the schools, they have a rubric in which the children would follow in order to demonstrate that they have met the goals of the assignment. And the same thing happens in work because you usually have a performance management review process and you'd have a work plan that you follow. And again, you would be demonstrating that you meet the goals in that process. So I just have a quick statement here just saying that the priorities and goals might be different in an Indigenous approach. And we can elaborate that more on the second line in terms of meeting responsibilities. Now, I was very cryptic here, just more or less putting the word budget, but that is more to say that when we get into responsibilities, when we're, say, finished post-secondary school or finished high school, we kind of rolled into this package where the expectation is we're going to save for retirement, we're going to save for buying a house, we're going to save for buying a car, we're going to make sure that we have proper financial management so that we can have credit cards. So there is a lot wrapped up in the Western society around these financial goals. So the concern is with an Indigenous approach, the highest priorities are responsibilities to the natural world and the treaties held with animals. So that's very, very different thinking. I was lucky enough to have John Burrows. He's actually an Indigenous lawyer. He's living in BC right now, but he is from my home community, which is Chippewas of Nawash on the Bruce Peninsula. It's referred to as Neoshingaming in the Ojibwe language, and that's in Ontario. He had told us that the responsibility that our own community has is first and foremost with the animals and the natural world. So that suggests that when we had been doing treaty making with the Westerners that came into the country, we had our own ideas of what a treaty was because we already had well-established treaties. And as well, Indigenous people had been making treaties across different groups of Indigenous peoples. So we were experts, you could say, at treaty making. And so when the Westerners said, okay, let's make some treaties, we were like, yes, great, we know how to make treaties. But of course, there's a very different outcome in terms of what had actually occurred once those treaties were signed. So enacting expected rules, again, back to school and work, it's just really to say, for example, I was in the Yukon again. If you just sort of walk down the street on the sidewalk and then you kind of stop and you act like you're going to put your foot out, and this was maybe 10 years ago, I think it's grown a lot since then. But at that point in time, the social norm was the cars would put on the brakes. You didn't have to be at a crosswalk. If someone wanted to cross the road, the cars would stop for you. And that was an accepted norm in that area. So we learn these things at school, work, these kinds of environments, and in our communities. With the Indigenous approach, there's a lot of natural world rules that are learned through engagement and having that time on the land. You're hearing a lot of land-based learning, land-based healing, land-based hunting. There's a lot of push now to have these types of programs out on the land because of this background. Lastly, nurturing relationships. So this statement I have here is all to say that when you go away from work and you take some time off, bereavement time, quite often that's a week, maybe 2 weeks tops. However, in Indigenous settings, these are usually a month as a norm. And so there's a lot of concern around retention. When we're thinking about these productive acts and what the differences are in terms of the expectations from the different world viewpoints, one can understand that if we are evaluating a employment program and we're also looking at the longevity, the long-term impacts, and so part of that is measuring the retention of the workers. And then you get into this Indigenous people taking extended periods of time away, and the retention policy or the retention strategy is not appropriate or suitable because of all these complexities that Indigenous people are dealing with. So quite often you might miss that if you didn't have this kind of inside knowledge around what are the cues. And quite often logic models, for example, would miss environmental factors. There's a logic model I really liked, and that was the top logic model by Rockwell and Bennett. And that was done in the 90s. And actually, they had social and environment into their logic model. And at some point, while logic models had gone through the different hands, quite often you don't see environment included at all, or social factors. I just bring this here to point is you might want to envision, well, what does an Indigenous evaluation look like in terms of a model? Oh, this is very simplistic here. I don't expect that people would give you this answer if you ask them, but only to say this is a simple way to say we could bring spirit, mind, body, and emotions into the circles here. And then you could see each layer is for each one of those elements. And then we would say that spirit's at the center of all human acts. Now, that's something we have to figure out, is how do we adequately bring the four elements into the evaluation process. We have done that with a tool we developed, the Waweya evaluation tool. And we have a storyboard, and in there we have a legend where people would intersect with mind, body, spirit, and emotion onto telling their stories on a tree branch. So the whole point here is because elders are very, very, very cognizant. And if you ask any elder, how should Indigenous evaluation being done? Most often you would hear them saying, including mind, body, spirit, emotion. So what does that mean? Just quickly, you may not be familiar with all four elements. A lot of models use maybe just three of the elements, sometimes even just two. But spirit stays strong and true to the course of one's true path. And we'll talk a little bit more about spirit in a minute. Mind leads, desires change, understands complexity of change. So while you think the mind is the leader, actually, according to Indigenous healers, the spirit is the leader. Emotions are doorways to our true feelings and can help shift to change. So again, here, when we say true feelings, that's like, you've got that gut, and women are really good at this in terms of just having that feeling about something. And that's what the emotion is. And we need to, as women, especially need to listen to our gut feelings. Body can keep us down, but always works to keep us up. So the body actually can become a leader, because most often when we're working in the medical health system, we're finding that the focus on the body is from a deficit-based approach, because we're looking at how sick or unwell the body is. But in this model here, the body is the last to know, because sickness actually starts at the spirit and then goes to mind, emotion. And finally, the body is the last element to show what is happening. Okay, so self-actualization, I want to get back at what is that spirit element. When we look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's basically a population pyramid, because according to him, and he takes an individual rights privilege, one lifetime scope of analyses. So the basis of the society is here at the bottom, just barely meeting their physiological safety and belongingness needs. And then he would say only the select few would get up to self-actualization. And then we get over to the Blackfoot side. This is where I say spirit comes into this, because when Anishinaabe people, those are my ancestors. So I can't speak for every First Nation community, but I can speak definitely confidently from my own. And so we get a name at birth, and then that is called our spirit name. And that is actually an example of self-actualization, because the spirit name is an indication of your journey here on this life, on this earthly plane. And so that is why it's self-actualization, because through that spirit name, you can self-actualize your understanding of yourself now and yourself in the future, in terms of how you're going to transfer and translate through that path and that journey. So with the Blackfoot, this is a teepee diagram, and they would have community actualization next, and then cultural perpetuity. And then this is within expansive concepts of time and multiple dimensions of reality. So this understanding here on the right outside of the teepee is where the elders who would come up with the spirit name of the child, they would get that information from these expansive time and multiple dimensions of reality. That's where the information comes from. And so the importance of the cultural perpetuity here is that for Indigenous people, and I think you've heard this, because pretty much people would say, like, as if Indigenous people have developed a program, and if they've taken a program, they've adopted it into the community. Well, normally what they say is that they've added cultural information, cultural cues, cultural nuances, cultural content. And so the idea is that when we're thinking about how do we support this self-actualization and this community actualization, well, at the heart of it is the culture. The culture is, and so it's actually Maslow's hierarchy of need goes here from the bottom up, but actually this is a multi-dimensional, and that's how we say there's multi-dimensions of reality, because this is actually a multi-dimensional teepee structure where you could almost also see it in a cyclical process, because actually the cultural perpetuity, self-actualization, community actualizations are all intermixed and interdependent on each other and completely present at any one point in time. So I'm just going to stop there. I would say this one thing about neuroplasticity. There's been some research into this. Dr. Michael Yellowbird, he has a Vimeo out. He also wrote in a book called Decolonizing the Mind for Indigenous Minds Only. But he has a very good speech on neuroplasticity. And what I would say is that this is something we need to look more into, because if there's another thing I've heard from elders about evaluation processes, is that you cannot start to study and evaluate ceremonies. That's a big no-no. So how are we going to understand what's the ceremonial results? Well, that's what Dr. Michael Bird has done. He has done brain scans of people before and after ceremony, and the results are striking. And he says that they're very similar to mindfulness training results, except they can be much more impactful. And he actually shows the parts of the brain where the ceremony has impacted. And then he lists what are the qualities of skill sets and actions that a person would take because their brain is enhanced in these areas. So you can actually get, and a lot of the data is around the mindfulness training as well, because he's showing the interlance between the different brain scans. And then what we can understand then is that because they have participated in these ceremonial activities, then they do get these outcomes. And then he's listed what those outcomes are. So then this is a way of doing data collection, but we're doing it from a third party instead of doing direct data collection in the communities related to ceremonial activities. So I think we have time to look very briefly at the Awakening the Journey Vision model. Now, this is a one-page summary. It is, in fact, actually a much longer, elaborate explanation for the larger file that was developed. And so actually none of this information is in that larger file, but this is an extrapolation of all of that other information into a table. And so what I had done here is you can see progress is the dimension of measurement. So we are having progress both going forward and backwards, much as that diagram that we had looked at the beginning. And as I had indicated, the pillars are spirit, relationship, and process. And so no mistaking here, process that you understand as an evaluator is the same thing. However, when we actually think what are the appropriate processes to be looking at in an Indigenous setting, then we might have those being in areas that we had not previously conceived. Relationships, again, are again in an Indigenous setting, like you can see here, we're not bean counting how many relationships have been struck, how many partnerships have been struck. And then spirit, I just want to say here, because I just want to make sure we don't run out of time, I will elaborate a little bit more, but I want to make sure you know a little bit of each. And spirit is what we have here is beginning and ceremony. But what we can think of that actually is I have done some recent evaluation work across the country. And a number of the projects that I worked with in that contract were non-Native organizations providing services in Indigenous settings. And one of the most striking examples was where one of the organizations had such a profound, tightly, healthy, well put together teamwork environment that I had felt like they had actually begun in a way of ceremony because of the trueness of their team effort and their communication and how they supported each other in their teamwork environment. So it was just really beautiful to observe and participate in. And to me, that really seemed to be also a ceremony. So you can have a spiritual ceremony, but can also have a teamwork ceremony. And there may be other settings that you may come up with that you think belong in here. And so these three pillars are explained in much more detail in that larger file I was talking about so that you can get a better understanding of what they mean. But we do have time here at the bottom as part of our table with beginning and past, experiences and present, transition, future and current states. So what you'll find here is we are using this page here as an analysis effort. And so what you can understand then is instead of developing the logic model, which predicts the future in essence, we are taking a different approach. So we're not focused on what the exact output and outcome would be. Instead, we're taking very much a process-based approach. And if you do look at the literature, Indigenous evaluation is very much pushing towards process over outcome-based approaches. And so what we have done here is actually, instead of specifying what we anticipate will happen, we're specifying what should happen in order to support a successful service delivery. Again, so that's more about process, but what people enjoy, and even the non-native organizations that we had worked with, that I had said we had worked with recently, very much enjoyed this and actually saw themselves at each one of these steps in the work they'd done. And what I can say is that they had been able to reflect on this and apply this into their setting because, and it was really the relationship mechanisms that they had undertook that were crucial to enabling them to embrace this entire matrix here as being valid and explaining their experiences and their efforts in providing services in Indigenous settings. So I'll just give 5 minutes of examples here. So relationships are built on Indigenous values and culture. Well, what I really liked, one of these programs told me, is that they had taken on a deep, intense cultural sensitivity, cultural safety training before they implemented their program. Then that way, even though they were non-native, they had actually felt that the basis of their success was on that training that they took. And so they could relate here because then they were feeling that they could be inclusive and respectful. Because the thing is, and when you talk about decolonizing the mind, the challenge is we could think that our eyes are open and we're wearing an Indigenous lens, but we're only going to see our awareness and how much we're aware of. But they had felt that they had reached a very expansive awareness by the time their program started because of that training. Now, another example I like here in the spirit is the funding arrangements are flexible and reflect the intervention context. Now, this is one thing that we really need to focus on with Indigenous evaluation is the funding vehicle, because too many times we will say, okay, what did the worker do and how many clients did she have? Well, I'll tell you, I've been all across Canada in many different communities. And if there's one thing that's happening out there under that kind of regime is fudging the numbers. So, you think you're getting appropriate data, but you're not. And so you're just supporting a cyclical trauma experience for those workers because now they've become liars. So that's a concern we have. So we need to look at the funding arrangement in terms of its templates, its funding, the restrictions around the funding, all of these elements, and to understand as well if there has been flexibility and reflection on the Indigenous setting in which is being provided. Now, to give another example, relationships are conducted in a manner that reflects Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. Now, what I really liked, and actually right here, what you like too is like between the cells, they can be really transparent and translucent in terms of, if we look at the second one as well, for this example, processes are experienced by target audience from a place that is molded by cultural ways of being and community building. So one of these example programs had their planning work plan. And again, these were non-native and a non-native organization. It was an institution. It was actually a university. And they had their funding work plan. And then they went out into the communities and then they listened, and they really wholeheartedly listened. And that was great because they actually found out that they had to throw their work plan in the garbage. And what they had thought they were going to be doing was taking their expertise in their department and transferring that directly into the communities. But what they found out when they got into the communities was that the best way for them to approach this instead was to build a relationship with the community, identify those individuals in the community who would be willing to share their knowledge with the rest of the community. And so then they actually gave empowerment to those individuals to develop their own training program and delivering that training program to the community members. So that was very much different as a role reversal. And we actually found that they had met both of these objectives in the table because of that.
Very nice, Andrea. Some really great examples there that help to, I think, really give us a sense of what Indigenous approaches are really all about.